Good evening, it's J. Stephen Roberts here from Real Crusades History. Hope you all are doing well tonight. I got a very interesting question from Jamie Bergamasco, who is a longtime contributor to our little community here at Real Crusades History of Crusades history enthusiasts. A very nice, cool guy. And Jamie actually asked, what he asked was peasants. His question was about medieval peasants. He wanted to know, did medieval peasants carry weapons, own weapons? And were there bans, that is laws, that prevented medieval peasants from carrying weapons? A very good question. This is something I think that kind of comes up a lot, and it does bring up sort of the popular imagination in terms of what medieval life was like. And I think that a lot of people do repeat this idea that there was some kind of law, some sort of mass ban on weapons for the peasantry in the Middle Ages. Like only the nobility could carry weapons, and it was illegal for a peasant to carry weapons. This is, well, to put it simply, it's just not really true. One thing about, when we look back at history, we tend to impose anxieties and experiences from our own culture and time and place onto the past. And one thing that people are constantly doing with the Middle Ages is they're imposing modern police states and superstates onto the medieval world. Today we have these very large, complicated states and governments that have all this surveillance capability and all this ability to control huge populations through these well-oiled police forces that can just dispatch immediately and, carry somebody off in the night. Of course, we saw that in places like communist Russia during the 20th century. And of course, we do have pretty advanced police forces and that kind of thing in the modern Western world as well. But in the Middle Ages, this wasn't possible. Of course, there wasn't the surveillance technology, but also the way that military life was organized. It just wasn't possible for the nobility to be involved in kind of this mass imposition of these real specific standards. Medieval law tended to be more practical, more about issues that occurred in daily life, disputes over land or farm animals or that kind of thing, marriage, and it tended to be solved when the parties kind of got together and brought the case before court. And laws varied from place to place, but there was no mass ban on weapons for peasants that I've ever found anywhere. In terms of peasants actually owning weapons, there was something, just as powerful that might have inhibited that, and that was just the fact that they couldn't afford a lot of the weapons that the nobility could afford. Something like a set of armor, a set of chainmail in the High Middle Ages, 12th century, 13th century, or a sword, a really nice sword, would have been extremely expensive items that only the wealthy could afford. However, there were weapons that would be available to peasants. For example, a lot of farm equipment doubled as weapons, a hammer, an axe, that kind of thing. And peasants did have that sort of stuff. And also, the other thing, too, is we have to remember that the medieval world wasn't uniform. It's not like you look at the entire history of the Middle Ages and say, okay, all the peasants, it was like this for them. No, not at all. You have different levels of wealth and poverty depending on where and what time you're looking at. In some periods, the peasantry, they were pretty well off in some areas. And other times they weren't. If you go back to the early Middle Ages, just after the fall of the Roman Empire, the peasants are going to more resemble, I think, what the popular imagination tends to view medieval peasants as. And that is these, I think there was a Monty Python movie where there's some peasants working in the field, and they say, "Oh, you must be a king," to this guy, and he goes, "Well, how do you know that?" And they say, "Well, because you haven't got shit on you." And that's kind of how we, in the 21st century, sort of imagine medieval peasants to be. They're just basically these people who were dirty all the time and filthy. But that's definitely an inaccurate generalization that doesn't really work from a historical perspective. Peasants weren't, just these bumbling, stupid, starved people. They were intelligent people who understood how to get food from the land and operate a village. And there were a lot of villages that were just well-oiled machines in a lot of respects, with very good productivity. And some villages that became very wealthy. There were definitely in the Middle Ages some peasants who were wealthier than some nobles. And even within a village, you could have a variety of different circumstances. You could have some wealthy peasant families in a village and some families that were more poor. And of course, regionally, that made a difference too. But now this other matter of peasants and weapons is that medieval peasantry, especially as we get into the High Middle Ages, well, they're involved in military operations. They get involved in armies. They're expected to do military service mainly as infantry. So, in that circumstance, of course, there's going to be a lot of variety too. Some infantry were kind of just almost like these sort of loosely organized rabbles. But then there were some infantries that were very well organized and that had nice weapons, maybe even some armor, some good lances, that kind of thing. And you see more of that as the High Middle Ages progress. There used to be this idea in earlier periods of medieval history that, say like the mid-20th century and then, earlier than that, there was this idea that medieval armies were pretty much the main thing, and the only really important thing was the cavalry. The nobility, of course, were the cavalry. And, the infantry was just kind of a bunch of like this mob with some pitchforks who kind of just followed them and sort of was a sideshow. Historians have recently discovered that this isn't the case, that in fact infantry played an important role in medieval armies. And this idea that all that counted was the cavalry just wasn't important. And some infantries were pretty well trained. In Flanders, for example, they developed a very good infantry. And also, as we look at the Crusades, in the Crusader states, the infantry became very, very important because the warfare with the Muslims required a very solid and well-organized infantry. And so you got to see a lot of peasants from the lower classes, or even some very, very minor nobility, if in a certain respect, who were involved in the infantry and who became veterans, rather seasoned veterans, you might say. And the idea was that the infantry protected the cavalry until the right moment when the cavalry could be dispatched for the charge. But, another area too we have to look at is the archers. Archers became kind of a profession in and of themselves, and as the medieval world developed, archery and archers in an army became more and more important and more professionalized. And these were men largely from the lower classes. And this was a skill that these guys would develop that was very, very valuable and very important, and they became an integral part of their country's army. So I think that kind of should clear up some of these misconceptions, I guess, about the medieval world and medieval peasants. Medieval peasants were not just... Well, for one thing, I think that the thing I really want to emphasize is that they weren't all the same type of people. It's kind of like today, The medieval world was complex, just like our world. There was all kinds of possibilities and circumstances. You did have peasants who were destitute and near starving, but that certainly wasn't the norm, especially as the High Middle Ages, got underway. And, Western Europe became very wealthy and very productive and very powerful in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And the peasantry rose right along with that. And, you would never be able to have that kind of highly developed society if all the peasants were just in abject starvation, poverty. It just doesn't happen. Another myth you hear a lot about in regards to medieval society is this idea that it was completely immobile. Like you had these impenetrable class barriers. You had the nobles and then you had the peasants. And there was just no leeway there in terms of income or wealth, which is in fact not true. I mean, you've got nobility who squandered their fortune and went into poverty, in a generation or two. And then you have, peasants who, because their village is doing really well, become, wealthy. And you've got peasants who end up wealthier than some nobles. And it kind of, you really had every spectrum of people in terms of, income or wealth in this period. You really did. It was a different type of economy than we're used to thinking of, but there was a lot of variety there. And, you could start out rich and end up poor, and you could start out poor and end up rich. So Jamie, I do hope that answers your question, and I hope you all found this topic interesting. If you want to know more about it, there's a couple places I would go. There's a really great book called The Art of Warfare in Western Europe During the Middle Ages, and that's published by Boydell. And this book is really great just in terms of general medieval warfare, but there's amazing info in here about the infantry and how medieval infantry was organized and some of the more up-to-date understanding we have of the importance of medieval infantry. In terms of a book just kind of that touches on the peasants, I would recommend Regine Pernod's book, Those Terrible Middle Ages, where she debunks a lot of common myths about the medieval world. And she does talk about peasants in that book. But there aren't a lot of really detailed studies about medieval peasants. Most books and scholarship about the Middle Ages does tend to focus on the church and the nobility, just because there's less information about the peasants. But as we learn more about them, we're coming to understand that traditional views of them, just kind of as these endlessly put upon people is really inaccurate. So, if you're out there and you're looking for an area of study, you might consider becoming an expert in the medieval peasantry and looking into that, because there's definitely a need for more books and scholarship about that. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys. I appreciate it very much. Do subscribe to Real Crusades History. If you haven't, just click the subscribe button. Also, if you want to support what I'm doing financially, there's a donate link in the About box. It allows you to make a PayPal donation to Real Crusades History. And finally, I have a Facebook page for Real Crusades History, which is a very good way to keep up with what I'm doing. So just find Real Crusades History on Facebook. The link is in the About box, and click like on that. Thanks.